A hush fell over the auction barn as the infamous Stallion burst into the ring, a tornado of muscle and fury. Blaze's coat gleamed like polished copper in the harsh arena lights, his wild eyes rolling white with terror and rage. Spectators pressed against the railings, their whispers creating a current of tension. "That's the one they couldn't break," someone muttered. "Put 3 men in the hospital." The auctioneer's voice wavered slightly as he began his patter, clearly uncomfortable with the dangerous animal before him. Blaze reared, striking out with hooves that could shatter bone. The handlers struggled to control him, their faces tight with fear. That's when Jake Mitchell stepped forward, his weathered Stetson pulled low over eyes that never left the horse. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for the tall, lean cowboy whose reputation had once matched his quiet confidence. Now, whispers followed him too, about the divorce, the failing ranch, the mounting debts. As Jake approached the ring, something remarkable happened. Blaze, who had been thrashing and striking out, suddenly went still. His ears, previously pinned flat against his skull, flicked forward. The stallion's nostrils flared, drawing in Jake's scent across the distance that separated them. Jake stepped to the fence, one hand resting on the top rail. He didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply stood there, his breathing slow and even, his eyes locked with the stallion's. For a breathless moment, it seemed as if everyone in the auction barn had forgotten to exhale. The stallion took one hesitant step forward, then another. The handlers exchanged bewildered glances as Blaze approached the fence where Jake stood, lowering his proud head until his muzzle nearly touched the cowboy's outstretched hand. "Sold." The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that broke the spell. "Sold to Jake Mitchell." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd as Jake quietly signed the paperwork and arranged for transport. How could this cowboy, who everyone believed would fail, connect with such a wild and untamable horse? But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back to when everything seemed impossible. 6 months earlier, Jake Mitchell sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills illuminated by the single overhead light. The ranch house felt too big, too empty since Sarah had left, taking half their savings and all his confidence with her. Outside, the Montana wind howled through gaps in the barn siding he hadn't found time to repair. The Mitchell family ranch had weathered 3 generations of hardship, but Jake wondered if his would be the hands that finally surrendered it. The drought had decimated his hay crop, cattle prices were down, and the bank had started sending letters with words like foreclosure and final notice. He rubbed his calloused palms over 3 days' worth of stubble, feeling every one of his 42 years. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, much like his prospects. The local livestock auction wasn't something Jake had planned to attend that week. He had no money to buy and nothing worth selling. But his neighbor Hank had insisted he come along, claiming the change of scenery might do him good. In reality, Jake knew Hank was worried about how isolated he'd become since the divorce. The auction barn smelled of dust, manure, and desperation, a scent Jake recognized all too well these days. He leaned against the back wall, half listening to the auctioneer's rapid-fire delivery, when a commotion erupted near the holding pens. "That stallion's gone crazy again," someone shouted. Nearly took off Johnson's arm. Jake found himself moving toward the disturbance, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. Through the crowd, he caught his first glimpse of Blaze, magnificent despite the fear and rage that consumed him. The stallion's copper coat was marred with scars, some fresh, some long-healed. His eyes held a wildness that spoke of betrayal. "What's his story?" Jake asked a man standing nearby. "Belonged to old Harmon before he passed. Wild-caught Mustang cross, I heard. Harmon's son tried breaking him the old way, spurs and submission. Horse fought back something fierce. They're calling him Untamable now, selling him for whatever they can get." Something twisted in Jake's chest, recognition, perhaps. He knew what it meant to be broken by circumstances, to lash out when cornered. As the stallion was led into the ring, handlers struggling to control him, Jake saw not a dangerous animal, but a kindred spirit. When the bidding opened, the barn fell silent. Nobody wanted a horse with a reputation for violence. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable, ready to move on to the next lot. 200, Jake called out, surprising himself as much as everyone else. Hank grabbed his arm. "Have you lost your mind? That horse is nothing but trouble." 200 going once, the auctioneer called, relief evident in his voice. Twice. Sold to Jake Mitchell. Driving home with the trailer rattling behind his truck, Jake questioned his sanity. He had no business buying any horse, let alone one nobody could handle. But watching Blaze through the trailer window, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. The first week with Blaze tested that purpose to its limits. The stallion demolished a section of fencing, kicked through a water trough, and nearly trampled Jake when he attempted to bring hay into the paddock. Jake's sister Maggie didn't mince words when she visited. "You're throwing good money after bad," she said, watching Blaze pace the perimeter of his enclosure. "That horse is as broken as this ranch, Jake. Sometimes you need to know when to cut your losses." But Jake saw something in Blaze that others missed. Behind the fear and aggression was intelligence and a desperate desire to understand. So instead of forcing the issue, Jake pulled up an old lawn chair and placed it outside Blaze's paddock. Each morning and evening, he'd sit there quietly, sometimes reading aloud from the newspaper, sometimes just watching. Days passed this way. Blaze would snort and paw, keeping his distance. But gradually, his circles grew smaller, his attention more focused on the quiet man who made no demands. On the seventh day, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the paddock, Jake dozed in his chair, hat tipped forward over his eyes. He awoke to the soft nicker of a horse and the warm puff of breath against his hand. Blaze stood before him, separated only by the fence rails, his ears pricked forward in curiosity. Jake remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly, he lifted his hand, palm flat. Blaze's nostrils flared, taking in his scent. Then, so briefly Jake might have imagined it, the stallion's muzzle brushed against his fingertips before he wheeled away, trotting to the far end of the paddock. That night, Jake slept better than he had in months. Progress came in small increments after that. Jake established a routine that Blaze could anticipate, feeding at the same times, speaking in the same calm tones, moving with deliberate slowness. He spent hours observing the stallion's body language, learning to read the flick of an ear or the tension in his shoulders. 2 weeks after bringing Blaze home, Jake entered the paddock for the first time without a pitchfork or bucket as shield. He simply stood with his back to the fence, eyes downcast, waiting. Blaze circled warily, nostrils flared, muscles bunched for flight. "It's just you and me," Jake said softly. "No hurry, no pressure. We've both got nothing but time and everything to prove." When Blaze finally approached, stretching his neck to sniff Jake's shoulder, it felt like a victory greater than any blue ribbon he'd won in his rodeo days. He didn't reach to touch the horse, didn't push for more. That moment of voluntary connection was enough. Word spread about Jake's project. Some neighbors drove by just to catch a glimpse of the crazy cowboy and his killer horse. Others stopped to offer unsolicited advice. "You need to show him who's boss," insisted Clint Barker, a local trainer known for his quick results and harsh methods. "Horse like that needs a firm hand, not all this waiting around." "You're wasting your time, Mitchell." Jake just nodded politely and continued his patient approach. Each day brought small breakthroughs. Blaze accepting a gentle touch along his neck, standing calmly while Jake moved around him, eventually allowing a soft brush across his withers. As autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Jake realized that caring for Blaze had become his anchor. The hours spent with the stallion gave structure to days that had previously stretched empty before him. The small victories they shared reminded him that patience could yield results when force failed. Even the ranch seemed to respond to his renewed energy. Jake repaired fences, cleaned out gutters, and patched the barn roof before winter set in. He wasn't saving the ranch yet, but he was no longer surrendering to its decline. One crisp October morning, Jake entered the paddock with a halter, not expecting success, but willing to try. Blaze eyed the equipment suspiciously, backing away several steps. "It's all right," Jake murmured, letting the halter hang loosely from his hand. "We don't have to do this today." He sat cross-legged in the dirt, placing the halter on the ground beside him. For nearly an hour, he simply talked to Blaze about inconsequential things: the weather, the hawks circling overhead, the memories of riding these hills as a boy. Gradually, Blaze's curiosity overcame his caution. He approached, sniffed the halter, then allowed Jake to stroke his forelock. It wasn't until the third attempt, days later, that Blaze accepted the halter. When the buckle finally closed, Jake felt a lump form in his throat. Trust, once broken, was so difficult to rebuild, for horses and humans alike. Then came the night that nearly destroyed everything they'd built. The storm rolled in from the northwest, bringing wind that bent the pines and lightning that split the sky into jagged pieces. Jake had secured everything he could, but as the rain pounded against the windows, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive crack of breaking wood followed by the panicked whinny of a terrified horse. He grabbed a flashlight and raincoat, rushing into the deluge. The beam of light revealed his worst fear, the paddock gate hanging from a single hinge, and no sign of Blaze. For hours, Jake searched, calling until his voice gave out, following hoofprints that disappeared in the muddy earth. The rain soaked through his clothes, plastering his shirt to skin gone numb with cold and fear. By dawn, exhausted and defeated, he returned to the empty ranch house. The bank's final notice sat on his table, the red lettering stark against the white paper. 30 days to pay or vacate. Jake slumped into a chair, water pooling around his boots on the worn linoleum. He had failed the ranch, failed Blaze, failed himself. 3 days passed with no sign of the stallion. Jake placed calls to neighboring ranches, drove every back road within 20 miles, but found nothing. On the fourth morning, his phone rang before sunrise. Mitchell? It's Pearson from the North Ridge. Think I found your horse. He's in bad shape, caught up in some barbed wire in my west pasture. Better come quick. Jake's truck fishtailed on the still muddy road as he raced to the Pearson place. When he arrived, the sight nearly brought him to his knees. Blaze stood trembling, his magnificent coat sliced by cruel metal barbs, blood matting his right foreleg. His eyes, once defiant, now held only pain and exhaustion. He won't let anyone near him, Pearson explained. Damn near took my hand off when I tried. Jake approached slowly, his heart hammering. Hey boy, he called softly. Remember me? Blaze's ears flicked forward at the sound of Jake's voice. The stallion nickered weakly, taking a halting step forward before the wire pulled tight, drawing a fresh line of blood. For the next hour, Jake worked with agonizing slowness, speaking continuously in a low, soothing voice as he carefully freed Blaze from the wire. When the last barb was removed, the stallion sagged against him, too exhausted to maintain his fear. The vet came and went, leaving behind antibiotics, instructions for wound care, and a guarded prognosis. If infection sets in, you might lose him, she warned. And even if he heals physically, trauma like this can set training back months, maybe permanently. That night, Jake slept in the barn, his bedroll spread on the straw beside Blaze's stall. Every few hours, he woke to check the horse's temperature and apply fresh salve to the wounds. In those quiet hours, with only the soft sounds of the stallion's breathing for company, Jake made a decision. The ranch had been his grandfather's dream, his father's legacy, but perhaps his own path lay elsewhere. If he sold now, before foreclosure, he might salvage enough to start over somewhere smaller, somewhere he could focus on healing Blaze and, perhaps, himself. As dawn broke, Jake called Maggie. I need a favor, he said, his voice rough with lack of sleep. There's a horse trainer named Caroline Westover in Sheridan. They say she works miracles with traumatized horses. Can you find her number for me? Caroline arrived 3 days later, a slight woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She observed Blaze from outside his stall, noting how he positioned himself, how his eyes tracked movement, how he responded to Jake's voice. You've done good work with him, she said finally. Most horses with his background wouldn't allow anyone near them after what he's been through. But, Jake prompted, hearing the reservation in her tone. But he's still terrified. The trust you've built is fragile, based on your patience, yes, but also on routine and familiarity. Real partnership needs to withstand unexpected challenges. For the next several weeks, Caroline visited regularly, guiding Jake through exercises designed to strengthen Blaze's confidence. They worked with tarps that rustled in the wind, with balls that moved unpredictably, with umbrellas that opened and closed. Each new object presented a fear to overcome, each success building a foundation for the next challenge. Horses live in the moment, Caroline explained one afternoon as they watched Blaze investigate a plastic bag tied to a fence post. They don't analyze the past or worry about the future. That's their gift to us, teaching us to be present. Jake thought about his own tendency to dwell on failures and fears. Perhaps that was his lesson to learn. The day Blaze allowed Jake to remove the last of his bandages marked a turning point. The wounds had healed into pale scars, barely visible against his copper coat. As Jake's fingers gently traced the marks, Blaze lowered his head, leaning into the touch with a sigh that seemed to release months of tension. "You ready to try something new?" Jake asked, bringing out the saddle blanket he'd been gradually introducing over the past week. Blaze eyed it warily but stood his ground as Jake slowly raised it to his back. The moment the blanket settled across his spine, Blaze trembled but didn't bolt. Jake praised him softly, stroking his neck, sharing his breath. Progress accelerated after that. The saddle followed the blanket, introduced gradually. First just the weight, then the cinch, loose at first, then snug. Each step built on the last, each success celebrated. The first time Jake put his foot in the stirrup, he held his breath, ready for Blaze to explode. Instead, the stallion turned his head, watching Jake with an expression that seemed to say, "Is this all you were worried about?" When Jake finally swung into the saddle, settling his weight carefully, Blaze stood perfectly still. Only the rapid rise and fall of his sides betrayed his nervousness. Jake didn't ask him to move, just sat quietly, letting them both adjust to this new connection. "Good boy," he whispered, leaning forward to stroke the stallion's neck. "We did it." The annual spring showcase at the county fairgrounds had been a tradition for as long as Jake could remember. Ranchers brought their best stock, trainers demonstrated their methods, and the community celebrated their shared heritage. This year, Jake entered Blaze in the rehabilitation class, a special category for horses that had overcome significant challenges. As they waited their turn outside the arena, Jake felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Clint Barker studying Blaze with obvious surprise. "I'll be damned," Clint said. "You actually did it. Never thought I'd see that horse under saddle." Jake nodded, acknowledging the backhanded compliment. He just needed someone to listen instead of tell. When their names were called, Jake guided Blaze into the arena with the lightest touch of his legs. The same crowd that had once whispered about the untamable stallion now watched in awe as horse and rider moved as one, executing a simple but flawless pattern that showcased Blaze's natural athleticism and newfound confidence. As they completed their final circle, Jake caught sight of a familiar face in the stands, the bank manager who had signed his foreclosure notice. The man nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that meant more than any ribbon. Later, as Jake loaded Blaze into the trailer for the drive home, Caroline approached with a business card in hand. "I've got more clients than I can handle," she said. "People with horses like Blaze. Good animals that just need the right approach. They need someone who understands that healing takes time." She pressed the card into his palm. "Think about it." That evening, Jake sat on his porch steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Blaze grazed contentedly in the paddock, occasionally looking up as if to check that Jake was still there. The ranch would go on the market next week. It wasn't failure, Jake realized, but transformation. The land had served its purpose, providing the space and time he and Blaze had needed to heal. Now they would carry that healing forward, helping other horses, and perhaps other people, find their way back from broken places. "We did good, boy," Jake called softly. Blaze lifted his head, ears pricked forward, eyes clear and untroubled. In that moment of perfect understanding, Jake knew they had both found what they needed most, not just a second chance, but the courage to make it count.